It's a common taunt in football, especially when your opponent is doing quite well and you haven't got much else to shout about, to point out that they haven't got many fans.
You've got no fans?
Yes, you've got no fans, rubbish ground, no fans, and your support is flipping rubbish are all chants that can be heard the length and breadth of Britain every weekend, not necessarily with language as carefully crafted as that, but of a roughly similar nature. Today's video isn't about Manchester City, Burton Albion, or MK Dons though. Much as they may be the butt of many jokes, those three average over 50,000, 3,000, and 6,000 fans at their home games in the first, third and fourth tiers of English football. FC Arouca, on the other hand, have averaged just 1,630 fans at their home games this season, despite the fact that they are competing in both the Primeira Liga, Portugal's top flight, and the UEFA Conference League, UEFA's tertiary competition this season. That is worse than any Saudi Pro League teams, let alone the rest of the Portuguese Primeira Liga. Arouca finished 5th in the top flight of Portuguese football last season, just one place below 19-time Portuguese champion Sporting, who currently lead the Primeira Liga table. At 20% of Arouca's games last season, despite the club flying high in what UEFA considers to be the 7th best league in Europe, fewer than 1,000 supporters turned up, and that includes away fans. Arouca aren't just interesting because of their lack of fans though. Oh no. They have also been on quite possibly the most extraordinary rollercoaster ride of any club in Europe, if not the world, over the last 10 to 15 years. Rising from the entirely amateur and regional 5th tier of Portuguese football, all the way to the Primeira Liga, qualifying for Europe, then dropping back down into the semi-professional 3rd tier of the Portuguese game, and then bouncing all the way back up to the top flight and qualifying for Europe once again last season. It's just a shame that no one was there to see it. Well, today we are going to make the all-too-rare visit to the Estadio Municipal de Arouca and perhaps give the least supported club in one of Europe's major leagues some much-needed publicity. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Arouca, a town that has been conquered by the Romans, the Moors, and the Christians, but not yet by a universal love of FC Arouca, as we take a look at the extraordinary rise, fall, and rise again of the club, and why, in spite of the remarkable journey that they have been on, no one can be bothered to turn up. When local businessman and construction tycoon Carlos Pinho became FC Arouca's club president in 2006, he outlined his dream of taking the club to the Primeira Liga. What Pinho called a dream, others might have deemed a delusion, and the deranged ramblings of a fantasist. Had anyone been paying any attention whatsoever to anything that was happening at Arouca back in 2006, that likely would have been their response. Over 5 decades since the club's inception in 1951, Arouca had never escaped the regional Aveiro leagues in the deepest, darkest depths of the Portuguese non-league game. The highest level Arouca had ever competed at was the 4th tier, having thrice reached those dizzying heights and thrice suffered immediate relegations in their only seasons competing at that level. Arouca's stadium at the time, if stadium is not too grandiose a term for it, was called the Campo Afonso Pinto de Margalies. An iconic, if tiny home ground, the Campo Afonso consisted of a football pitch and a miniature stand, which still provided adequate hospitality for Arouca's literally dozens of fans. The stadium was iconic because its fun-sized stand was built into the side of a hill, and the pitch itself was famed for its slanted gradient due to the local landscape, which made it highly unusual and irregular to play on. The Campo Afonso Pinto de Margalies, inaugurated in 1971, was named after, and you're not going to believe this, Afonso Pinto de Margalies, a wealthy Portuguese banker and businessman who also served as the president of Portuguese giants FC Porto from 1967 to 1972, during which time Porto won their first trophy since the 50s, and Margalies and his associates were credited with steering the club out of severe financial difficulties. During his 5-year stint as Porto president, Margalies also served as the honorary president of FC Arouca, and there was a very good reason for that. Throughout the early part of their history, Arouca was a feeder club for Porto, strategically located within the Porto district or Porto metropolitan area, in a region which already had a close affinity for the club, but about 15 kilometres, as the crow flies, outside of Porto's city walls themselves. When Pinho arrived in 2006 though, Arouca's partnership with Porto, formally at least, had been terminated, and the club was languishing down in the 5th tier of Portuguese football. It is worth noting that the 5th tier of Portuguese football is not remotely comparable to the 5th tier of English football, the National League, nor even to the regionalised 5th tier of the German game. No, the 5th tier of Portuguese football is much more similar to Sunday League football in England, populated predominantly by park pitches, with few fans, and where players are more likely to pay to play than be paid themselves. Think less Rochdale or Oldham Athletic, and more Dog and Duck or AFC Dog Dut. In this context, the Campo Afonso Pinto de Marglis was a state-of-the-art mega stadium compared to the home grounds of some of Arouca's divisional rivals, but nonetheless, Pinho had set his hopes higher than respectable by 5th tier standards and immediately began building a new ground. The site that he chose was 6 minutes down the road, where there stood just a field at the time. Once again, Arouca constructed just a single stand, though a much bigger one this time, and it wasn't built into the side of a hill. Pinho's logic was that he would build a stadium which complied with 3rd tier regulations in anticipation of Arouca reaching the 3rd tier, and given that he owns a construction company bearing his own name, and construction is the industry in which he amassed the lion's share of his fortune, it was something he was able to do with relative ease. With such lofty ambition and no lack of investment, Pinho's vision rapidly became a reality. Arouca won promotion in each of Pinho's first 2 seasons at the helm, initially reaching the 4th tier for the 4th time, where they had tasted instant relegation on their previous 3 visits, but this time battling to back-to-back promotions, only losing 9 games across Pinho's first 2 seasons, scoring 126 goals and conceding just 44 across 70 matches. It took Arouca just 2 seasons to get out of the 3rd tier as well, and all of a sudden, Pinho's dream of reaching the Primeira Liga didn't look quite so absurd. Arouca's rise was powered primarily, of course, by Pinho's resources, against competition that is not exactly awash with cash in Portugal's lower leagues, but also by a very distinct strategy. Pinho's plan was to bring in tried and tested players who had already performed at a higher level, mixed in with some of the best players competing at the same level as them. Between 2008 and 2011, Arouca signed some 6 players from Beira-Mar alone, who competed in the 1st and 2nd tiers during that time. Meanwhile, Arouca were down in the 3rd tier in 2008, only reaching the 2nd in 2010. One of those signings was José Sousa, a former Portuguese under-21 international, who could name Benfica, Porto and Braga among his list of former clubs. Sure, Sousa was on the verge of turning 33 when he joined Arouca, and he only stuck around for a single season, but the experience him and his fellow bigger-name arrivals brought was invaluable to the club, and it was a real statement of intent for a then 3rd tier team who had never played 2nd tier football before in their history, and had been in the 5th tier just 2 years before that. Sousa was one of many older heads who didn't stick around for long at Arouca, but made a huge impact during their short time at the club. Another was 6'5" Cameroonian centre-forward Jeremy Njock, then aged 30, who arrived from Estoril on a free transfer in the summer of 2010, led Arouca's scoring charts with a 1-2 record in his only season at the club, and Arouca's first playing at that level, proving pivotal in a very respectable 5th place finish. 32-year-old Brazilian centre-back Kiko also joined Arouca in that same summer of 2010 on a free transfer from Paços Ferreira, and not only formed the bedrock of the club's backline for the next 2 years, but bagged 13 goals in 53 games from centre-back in the process. Perhaps the ultimate Arouca veteran signing, though, was another Brazilian, namely 32-year-old João, who joined Arouca from Cypriot outfit Hermes, and set Portugal's 2nd tier alight over the next 2 seasons. In 62 games for Arouca, João scored a sensational 43 goals. In the 2012-13 season, it was Joano's 27 goals that fired Arouca to Primeira Liga promotion. In just 7 years since arriving at a fifth-tier club, Pinho had realised his dream, guiding Arouca to 4 promotions in 7 seasons. It was a remarkable achievement, and it meant that, just 7 years after Pinho's ambitious relocation and construction of a new ground, the Estadio Municipal de Arouca was already insufficient for the level that Arouca were about to compete at. Over the summer of 2013, Pinho's construction firm was drafted back in again and put to work, as Arouca's Estadio Municipal had to undergo major renovations to bring it in line with Primeira Liga requirements. The Estadio Municipal now has 2 stands, a racing track, adjacent training pitches, training centre, tennis court and swimming pool, and even its own car park with around 100 spaces, so, almost one for every Arouca fan. Once the work had been done, the Estadio Municipal de Arouca was still the smallest ground in the Primeira Liga, with a capacity of 5,000, but only very narrowly behind Estoril, Nacional, and Paços de Ferreira's home grounds, none of which had capacities over 5,300 at the time. True to form, Pinho didn't want to stop there though. His ambition is to have 3 grandstands at 3 ends of the ground, each with a capacity of 5,000, connected by pedestrian bridges which would tower above the pitch, in order to retain the racing track. That would make Arouca's ground the 7th largest in the Primeira Liga, trailing only the big 3, Braga, Vitória de Guimarães, and Braga, which is perhaps why it hasn't happened yet. After all, even with only a 5,000 capacity, Arouca's ground is currently less than a third full, on average, and the history of clubs that build stadiums that are clearly too big for their fan bases tends to be a pretty swift and disastrous one. Although Joano was about to turn 34 as Arouca prepared for their maiden top-flight campaign, his 27 goals put him on the radar of Rio Ave, who finished 6th in the Primeira Liga the previous season and reached the semi-finals of the Taça de Portugal. In the end, it was a move that worked out for no one. Arouca lost their talisman and top scorer, Joano only managed to score 1 goal in 14 games for Rio Ave, and Rio Ave themselves slipped to 11th in the league. Pinho stuck to what had worked for Arouca after reaching the promised land, in terms of recruiting tried and tested players, this time with Primeira Liga experience. Midfielders David Simão and Nuno Collio were signed from Benfica, Brazilian goalkeeper Cássio was brought in from Braga, and Guinea international Salim Cissé was signed mid-season on loan from Sporting. Arouca survived in their debut Primeira Liga campaign relatively comfortably, finishing 7 points above the drop in 12th. The following season was a little bit more of a close call, as Arouca slipped to 16th, but a 5-point cushion still separated themselves from the drop. In the summer of 2015, Arouca appointed Angolan coach Lito Vidigal and overhauled the squad that had got them into and had kept them in the top flight. In total, 15 new players were signed over the summer, including loan deals. Meanwhile, Arouca generated their first transfer revenue, as Mauro Goicoechea joined Toulouse in the summer, and Rodney Wallace headed for Sport Recife in the winter for a combined total of €700,000. In the 2015-16 season, Vidigal and Arouca shocked the Portuguese game, climbing all the way to 5th, 1 place above Rio Ave, and only 4 points behind Braga, qualifying for the Europa League during a campaign which included famous victories away at Arouca's old parent club Porto and at home to that season's Primeira Liga champions Benfica in the penultimate game of the season. Unfortunately, as is so often the case, Arouca became the victims of their own success. Talented Brazilian fullback Lucas Lima departed following his impressive debut campaign, joining Nantes for more than €1 million. Former Benfica man David Simão departed for CSKA Sofia, and Arouca's top scorer the previous season, Paraguayan forward Walter Gonzalez, was only ever on loan from Club Olimpia, and Arouca were unable to keep hold of him. In August, Arouca battled back from losing 1-0 at home against Olympiacos in the Europa League group stage playoffs to win 1-0 over 90 minutes away in the Greek capital, but 2 extra-time goals from the hosts saw Olympiacos progress ahead of them. It was a tough pill to swallow, both from a sporting and financial perspective, and Arouca went on to suffer not only European, but domestic heartbreak, as their threadbare squad was relegated by the narrowest of margins at the end of the season. It's worth noting that, although Pinho invested a lot of money in Arouca to fund their rise, the club went from Portugal's 5th tier to the Primeira Liga, finished 5th, and qualified for the Europa League, all without ever actually paying a transfer fee. The first transfer fee Arouca did cough up was following relegation in 2017, when they paid €250,000 to sign Serbian number 10 Alexander Palečević from Vojvodina. The move didn't work out, as Palečević struggled to settle and Arouca suffered a devastating second successive relegation, putting them back in the only semi-professional and part-time 3rd tier of the Portuguese game. It seemed, for just a moment, as though Pinho's dream had been realised beyond even his wildest expectations, but reality had rapidly come crashing down on Arouca. Palečević, though he proved to be a flop, represented a change in recruitment strategy by Arouca though. In the summer of 2019, following their back-to-back relegations, Pinho appointed his own son, Joel Pinho, as Arouca's director of football. Joel somewhat shunned the tried and tested strategy that had succeeded for his father for so long, and turned Arouca's attention to young and up-and-coming players instead, often from much more diverse markets, casting a far wider net. Arouca appointed Armando Evangelista as their new head coach, and as with Vidigal, he was given license to rip up the Arouca squad and start again. Even down in the 3rd tier, Arouca still signed players from Ghana, Brazil, Senegal, Nigeria and Argentina. In total, 23 players arrived that season, so basically an entire new squad. Arouca won back-to-back promotions back to the Primeira Liga under Evangelista, and they continued to look left field with their recruitment once they reached the top flight. Arouca signed players from Belgium to Brazil, Israel, Turkey and Croatia, and it seemed as though they could do no wrong. In the 2021-22 season, Arouca survived, and in 2022-23, they thrived. Arouca finished 5th last season, taking 4 points from their 2 games against Sporting and reaching the semi-finals of the Taça da Liga, where Sporting would finally get the better of them, but only by 2-1 thanks to a Paulinho brace and an 82nd minute winner. There were lots of differences between the Arouca teams that finished 5th in 2015-16 and in 2022-23, but unfortunately, what happened next was all too similar. Arouca's manager, Armando Evangelista, departed over the summer to join Goiás in Brazil. Star men like Anthony and João Basso were sold, Ode Dabar's contract expired, and impressive English centre-back Jeremy Poku departed for Istanbul Başakşehir on loan. Just as in 2016, Arouca lost in the playoffs in European qualification, this time much more miserably against SK Bran in the Conference League, and they are now bottom of the Primeira Liga table 10 games into the season, with only 6 points to their name. Having lost just 2 league games at home following the turn of the year last season, against Benfica and Porto, Arouca have lost their last 7 games on the bounce this season. To summarise, in the space of 17 years since Carlos Pinho arrived as president, Arouca have had 6 promotions and 2 relegations, perhaps soon to be 3. They have built a new stadium, renovated that stadium, risen from the 5th tier to finishing 5th in the top flight, and qualified for Europe, then dropped all the way back down to the 3rd tier with successive relegations, returned to the Primeira Liga following back-to-back promotions, finished 5th and qualified for Europe again, and now they're bottom of the league again and look likely to go down. It is quite remarkable. As to why Arouca has so few fans, well, you've probably got a decent idea by now. Until 2006, Arouca was the equivalent of a lowly non-league club who had never tasted any significant success or competed above the 4th tier of Portuguese football. Arouca was chosen as a feeder club for FC Porto, initially because of its location and existing ties to FC Porto themselves, and those ties haven't gone away. Arouca is less than a 50-minute drive from the Estadio de Dragão, Porto's more than 50,000-seater state-of-the-art home. Meanwhile, both Boa Vista and Famalicão are much further away than that. In short, Arouca face local competition from much bigger and more established clubs with more illustrious past than themselves, and it has proven very difficult, despite their remarkable journey, to recruit many converts over the last 10 to 15 years. Even if Arouca itself were FC Arouca mad, and FC Porto didn't still exert such significant local influence, the town itself only has a population of around 20,000 people. Remarkably, in fact, Arouca's population now, listed as 22,359 at the last census, is lower than it was when FC Arouca was first founded, all the way back in 1951. What's more, Arouca's crowds are actually falling, and not just because of their plight this season. Attendances rose to an all-time high of over 3,000 in the 2013-14 season, Arouca's first in the top flight, but even in their two fifth-place seasons, once the novelty of Primeira Liga football in Arouca had worn off, they have been unable to consistently put up those kinds of numbers. Arouca are basically the equivalent, to put it in an English context, of a club like Hyde United, who are located in Greater Manchester, with competition from the two Manchester Giants plus several larger provincial clubs, were briefly a quasi-Manchester City feeder club with an official partnership with the Citizens, and have never played above Step 5 of the Football League pyramid. If one were to imagine a local businessman somehow transforming Hyde United into a Premier League club, while their attendances would undoubtedly rise and become much larger than Arouca's, they would not easily convert Manchester United or Manchester City fans to their cause overnight. Salford City, similarly, have risen from Step 9 to Step 4 over the last 15 years, but still have among the lowest average attendance in League 2 at less than 3,000. Ultimately, Arouca's lack of support has hamstrung the club in terms of looking to push on following their two surprise fifth-place finishes, as has their inability to progress to the group stage of either of the European competitions they've qualified for, which would have provided the necessary resources for Arouca to solidify those gains. Instead, on both occasions, they have been rapidly undone, and that is a growing problem for not just upwardly mobile minnows like Arouca, but Portuguese football as a whole. The gap between the big three and Braga now, if you like, in the Primeira Liga, and everyone else, has become unhealthy and detrimental to the league as a spectacle. Whilst those four have maintained Portugal's spot in 7th in UEFA's league coefficients, it has become routine for every other Portuguese team that finishes in the European places to fail to even make the group stage. Arouca lost to a team that was playing second-tier football in Norway last season, but they are not alone. Vitória de Guimarães, who finished 6th last season, lost their Conference League second-round qualifier against Slovenian side NK Celje. The season before that, they lost in qualifying against Croatia's Hajduk Split. Meanwhile, Gil Vicente were thrashed 6-1 by AZ Alkmaar, and the year before that, it was Paços de Ferreira and Santa Clara who lost to Tottenham and Partizan Belgrade respectively. In every one of those seasons, the gulf between the top four and the rest has been enormous, sometimes as large as 20 points, and those three are already the top four, only 10 games into the current campaign. It's a great shame, because outside of the formidable four and the gross inequalities, which, it should be said, are far from exclusive to Portuguese football, the Primeira Liga is an incredibly entertaining league, where tactics have a funny old habit of going out of the window, and you routinely see both the brilliant and the bizarre in equal measure, in a manner that has been airbrushed from a lot of other major leagues. I would strongly recommend anyone to go and watch the highlights of Arouca's only win this season, a 4-3 victory against Estoril, for possibly the purest distillation of what I mean by that. And I promise you, you won't regret it. Arouca also aren't alone in Portugal when it comes to feeding off scraps for support, nor are they even the club for whom that is the most problematic. That would surely be 1999 Taça de Portugal winners, Premiera, who play at the €51 million, 32,830-seater Estádio Municipal de Aveiro, which was built to host 2 games at Euro 2004. Since those 2 games, the Estádio Municipal de Aveiro has been almost permanently empty. Even in the top flight, Premiera could only average 4,000 fans at their home games, less than 12.5% of the stadium's capacity, and since dropping into the 3rd tier in 2015, that's been more like 1 to 2%. Anyway, perhaps that is another video for another time, but I just found it interesting. If you found this video interesting, then go ahead and hit the like button. It is completely free of charge, and apparently it benefits me in some way, shape, or form. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you all, as ever, for watching, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all 3, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.